Again, we're heading towards the bottom of our panel here in terms of the time, but certainly last and not least, this is our final question for the panel, and this will be a specific one for Mr. Bernard. And we'd love to hear a little bit more if you could share. We know that you're bringing a whole lens specifically around human rights, especially, but could you share any examples of how the promotion of human rights played a role in policymaking on the environment? If you had any examples of how some might specifically be related to air pollution, be really helpful and interesting to hear as well. So over to you.
Thank you so much for that question. As for whether there are any specific links between the policies that have been, some of which have been presented today, and human rights, whether that link can be explicitly established is very difficult. And there is a dearth of experiences and insights about good practices that are informed by human rights, but also just experiences and insights about good practices in general. And this is something WHO has also expressed previously. So there is a need for a system that consolidates these good practices, some of which were described today, and perhaps ENET does that. But just one particular area that we believe, or that I would argue human rights have played a role. This is, of course, one of the landmark laws here in Asia, the Philippines Clean Air Act, and it's also linked to the right to a healthy environment, which is also explicitly recognized in the Philippines Constitution. But separately, there are other standards that have emerged from discussions of a healthy environment, but doesn't necessarily touch on human rights specifically. And we can see that in China, where stronger laws and policies and action have also been adopted. According to this report that I shared in the chat, there are several, David Boy underscores several laws in China that have resulted in levels of particulate matter in 74 cities decreasing by 33% over 5 years. So even though it doesn't specifically recognize a link between human rights and clean air, these types of developments contribute to that. Thailand has also passed a series of policies and control on air quality and emissions. Of course, these standards, these laws have their challenges. Some of them do not cover the breadth of emission sources, which have increased significantly over the years. And measures that are taken are usually reactive rather than proactive. And also enforcement gaps are still prevalent, since many of the environmental standards lack a solid enforcement mechanism, which is something that human rights can also help with. There is also another area which I think has developed quite rapidly over the last couple of years, and I think this was underscored here as well, and that's the access to information from air quality monitoring networks. Of course, there's different quality of those systems locally, but the number of air quality monitoring stations have, of course, expanded from just 100 in the last 20 years to now thousands, if not tens of thousands, across the region. And monitoring, as you know, is a prerequisite to fulfilling a state's obligation to provide information. And the right to information is usually cited in most human rights policies or laws, but also in environmental law. So in that case, I would say the right to information has had an impact on the development of air quality monitoring systems. And finally, I would like to mention that there is a trend, of course, where victims of air pollution in cities such as Jakarta, now Kuala Lumpur, are taking their cases to the courts, arguing that they have a right to breathe clean air, and also that they haven't accessed the necessary information about the risks that they face in relation to, as a result of incessant pollution or air pollution. And in Jakarta, recently, judges granted almost all of the plaintiffs last year, or favored their case, which was about a number of Jakartan residents who took the country's president and 6 top senior officials to court over air pollution. And they said that that the defendants had committed an unlawful act by neglecting to take measures to control air pollution in Jakarta. And much of this landmark decision was pointing to the inefficient or the inadequate information that came from the monitoring stations and other measures to improve the capital's air. So I would argue, even though it stopped short of agreeing that that this constituted human rights violations, you can see that some of the rights to, for example, information is being indirectly or implicitly mentioned in this case. And there's also now an upcoming petition in Malaysia, the so-called Chera petition, which will be looking at air pollution from a similar angle, from a human rights angle. And that's showing that there is now an escalating obligation of states to not only consider air pollution standards from an environmental legal point of view, but also from a human rights perspective. Yeah, thank you so much.